What if Robert Baratheon survived the Boar and stopped Ned Stark's execution? The Kingswood held its breath beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, the morning mist still clinging to the roots and hollows where the sun had not yet reached. Dew hung upon the ferns like scattered glass, and the air carried the wet, green smell of a forest awakened but not yet warmed. Through this hush moved the royal hunt, a clamor of horses and hounds and men who had drunk too deeply the night before and drunk again with their morning bread. Chief among them a king who had once been the terror of every battlefield in the realm, and who now carried the years like a second suit of armor, heavy and ill-fitting and impossible to remove. Robert Baratheon rode at the front, as he always did, his great frame swaying in the saddle and his laughter booming through the trees loud enough to send the smaller birds scattering. There was wine on his breath and wine in his blood, a warmth that made him feel young again, made him forget the aching of his joints and the softness of his belly, and the emptiness that had settled into him somewhere in the long, dull years since the war. He wanted to feel the old fire once more, the thing that had lived in him at the Trident when he had broken Rhaegar with a single blow. And so when the beaters flushed the great boar from its thicket, black and bristling and monstrous in its bulk, the king did not hesitate. He spurred his horse forward with a roar of pure joy, his spear leveled, blind to everything but the beast and the memory of the man he had been. The boar turned to meet him. It was a creature older than most men in that wood, scarred and cunning, and it did not flee as the smaller game had fled. It lowered its head, its yellow tusks catching the pale light, and it charged with a speed that no thing so large had any right to possess. Robert's spear struck it high on the shoulder and glanced away, the point turned by muscle and bone and matted hair, and for one terrible heartbeat the king was too close, his balance gone, the beast beneath him and its tusks rising toward the soft weight of his belly, where no armor guarded him. It was Sir Barristan Selmy who moved first, the old knight who had spent a lifetime watching for the moment when death came for the man he was sworn to protect, and his spear drove deep into the boar's flank, even as Sandor Clegane's own weapon punched through its neck from the other side. The two blows together turned the beast, wrenched it half around in its fury, and the tusk that should have opened Robert from navel to breastbone, instead tore a long, deep furrow through the meat of his thigh. Blood came in a hot rush, and the king bellowed, and then the boar was screaming and thrashing and dying beneath a forest of spears, while men shouted and horses reared, and the hound's grim face never once changed its expression. They bore him back to the Red Keep on a litter, pale and cursing and shaking with a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. And Grand Maester Pycelle came at once with his fires and his needles and his acrid smoking poultices. The wound was cleaned and burned and stitched with a swiftness born of genuine fear, for both men knew how such a gash could fester and turn black and carry off even the strongest of the strong within a week. But the flame did its work, and the rot never took hold, and by the third day, the fever that had crept into Robert's blood broke at last and left him weak but living, propped among his pillows in a chamber that smelled of tallow and old wine. It was in that dim and shuttered room, staring at the ceiling with the pain of a dull throbbing companion in his leg, that the king began to think in ways he had not thought in many years. He remembered the wine, how the boy had kept his cup filled all through the night and into the morning, how sweetly Cersei had bid him enjoy the hunt, when she never troubled herself with his pleasures otherwise. The thought came to him slowly, the way cold water seeps through a wall, and he could not yet give it a shape or a name, but it sat in his chest like a stone. "She filled my skin with wine," he muttered to the empty room. his voice thick and bitter, so the boar might finish what she has never dared to do herself. He did not truly believe it, not yet, and he could not have said what evidence he had beyond a husband's old resentment, but the seed was planted now, in soil made ready by years of loathing. He turned his head toward the door and called for his steward, and his voice found some of its old iron. "Find me Ned, find my hand, and bring him to me the moment you lay eyes upon him. I need an honest man." Yet the honest man he summoned was, at that very hour, standing in the cold green shadow of the godswood, with his own terrible knowledge heavy upon him, having already spoken to Cersei Lannister beneath the weirwood and given her the mercy of a warning, a chance to gather her children and flee before the truth of their begetting became a blade at all their throats. Ned Stark had believed the king dying, had shaped his every plan around the empty throne to come, and when the messenger found him with word that Robert lived, he felt the whole careful architecture of his intentions shudder and shift beneath his feet. The walk from the godswood to the king's chambers was not long, yet it seemed to Ned Stark the longest passage he had ever made, each step through the shadowed corridors of the Red Keep carrying him nearer to a reckoning he had spent days trying to shape and now could no longer control. The torches guttered in their sconces as he passed, and the guards at the door parted for him without a word, and when he crossed the threshold into the warm, close air of the sick room, thick with the smell of milk of the poppy and old blood and the particular sweetness of a wound that had been washed and sewn and washed again, he found the king propped against a mound of pillows with a look upon his face that Ned had not seen in many years. Robert Baratheon had brushed close against death, and death had left its mark upon him, not in fear, but in a strange and unfamiliar softness. The great ruin of his body lay heavy beneath the furs, the gash across his belly bound tight beneath layers of linen, and his skin had gone gray where once it had been ruddy with wine and appetite. Yet his eyes, when they found Ned's face, were clear, clearer than they had been in longer than either man could easily recall. He lifted one thick hand from the coverlet and beckoned his old friend closer, and Ned came and sat upon the stool beside the bed, as he had sat beside many sick beds in his life, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all. "I dreamed I was dead," Robert said at last, and his voice had lost its usual thunder and became something quieter, almost wondering. "I dreamed I stood before them all, my father, my mother, Lyanna, and I had nothing to show them but a fat man's belly and a kingdom I never bothered to rule. 17 years upon that cursed chair, and I cannot name 3 good things I did with them." He turned his head against the pillow, and something moved behind his eyes that might have been shameful. "Help me, Ned. Whatever time the gods leave me, help me use it better than I have. Help me be a king worth the name, if only for a little while." There are moments upon which the whole weight of a life comes suddenly to rest. Moments when a man must choose between the comfort of silence and the cruelty of truth. And Ned Stark understood as he looked into his friend's altered face that he had come to just such a moment and that he could not turn away from it. He had meant to speak only of the succession, of who should hold the realm should the wound take a turn for the worse. But the king had opened a door with his sudden softness, and behind that door lay everything Jon Arryn had died to uncover, and Ned found that he could not walk through it dishonestly. The truth had waited too long already, hidden in the pages of an old book and in the color of children's hair, and it pressed against his teeth like a thing that would no longer be kept. "Robert," he said, and the name came slow and heavy. "There is a thing you must know, and I would tell the gods it was not so." And then, in the low and steady voice of a man laying down a burden he could no longer bear, he told him, He told him of Jon Arryn's last days and the lineages the old man had traced, told him of the great book of houses with its endless recording of golden Lannister heads and black Baratheon ones, told him that in every union across 300 years, the seed of the stag had always shown itself, always, save in the 3 children who called Robert father. He told him that Joffrey and Myrcella and Tommen were none of his, that they were born of the queen and her own twin brother, that Jaime Lannister had put those children in Cersei's belly beneath Robert's very roof. The silence that followed was terrible in its brevity. Robert's face, which had been so soft, so open, seemed to collapse inward and then to swell, the gray draining away before a rising tide of scarlet, and with a roar that tore something loose inside his wounded belly and made him gasp even as he raged, he seized the wine cup from the table beside him and hurled it against the far wall, where it burst and ran down the stone in a long dark stain like a wound of its own. "The Kingslayer," he bellowed, spittle flying from his lips. "I'll have his head, I'll have it struck off in the yard, and I'll have her burned. That whore, that lying Lannister bitch. Guards, guards, bring me my armor and my hammer, and fetch that woman to me in chains." He tried to rise and could not, and fell back against the pillows white with pain, one hand pressed to the linen at his gut, and Ned rose swiftly and took him by the shoulders and held him down with the gentle firmness one uses upon the fevered. "You cannot," Ned said, low and urgent. "Not this way. Tywin Lannister sits at the Golden Tooth with 20,000 men, and Jaime commands swords within these very walls, and you are wounded, and the queen is not yet warned of what you know. Roar this loud, and you will have the Red Keep running with blood before the hour is out, and much of it your own." And Robert, breathing hard, his fury banking slowly into something colder and more careful, looked at his friend with the clearing eyes of a man who had very nearly died, and after a long moment, he gave a single grim nod and began, in a voice gone quiet again, to speak of watched gates and confined queens and the buying of a little time. Word of the king's survival moved through the Red Keep the way cold water moves through the cracks of old stone, slowly and without sound, seeping into chambers where it was least welcome. In the queen's apartments, the light came pale and gold through the high windows, and Cersei Lannister sat very still in a carved chair while a maid brushed out her hair, and she understood, with the clarity that comes to certain people only in the moment of their gravest danger, that everything had changed. Ned Stark had spoken. Robert lived. The two facts together were a blade laid against her throat, and she had built her whole life upon the certainty that no such blade could ever reach her. She dismissed the maid with a word and sat alone in the quiet, and she did not weep, for weeping was for women who had run out of moves, and Cersei was not yet such a woman. She summoned them to her one at a time, the men who held the small threads of power that might still be gathered into a rope. Petyr Baelish came first, smiling as he always smiled, that faint amusement that never quite reached the cool water of his eyes, and he bowed low and spoke softly of his sympathy for her difficulties, and offered nothing. She pressed him, watching his face, and found there only the smooth evasions of a man who had already begun to calculate which way the wind would blow, and had determined to stand precisely at the point where the wind could not knock him down. He would help her if she prevailed, and mourn her prettily if she fell, and commit himself to neither outcome until the outcome was certain, and Cersei knew this, even as he kissed her hand and withdrew, and she filed his treachery away with all the others. Grand Maester Pycelle came next, aged and stooped, his chain heavy upon his narrow shoulders. and he offered her a great show of loyalty and a great many words that amounted to counsels of patience and submission. But when he had shuffled back to his own chambers beneath the rookery, he did a thing he did not speak of to the queen. He climbed the winding stair to where the ravens kept their restless vigil, and by the light of a single guttering candle, he wrote in a small cramped hand a message meant for Casterly Rock, warning the great lion of the West, a treachery that Varys's little birds marked even as the shutter closed, and filed away against the day it might be useful, and that swords would soon be needed if the family were to be saved. He tied the parchment to the leg of a bird bound for the Golden Tooth, and he opened the shutter, and he let it go into the fading afternoon, and he watched the black shape dwindle against the reddening sky, and felt neither loyalty nor betrayal, only the long, cold habit of survival that had carried him through the reigns of many kings. It was Robert himself who came to her at last, walking slowly and heavily upon the arm of a squire, his great frame diminished by the wound at his belly, but his eyes clear and hard, in a way she had not seen them in years. She had expected fury, and she was prepared for fury, for a man in a rage was a man who could be turned. What she had not expected was the weariness in him. He looked at her a long time before he spoke, and when he spoke, his voice was low. She did not fall to her knees. She rose and faced him, and she gave him instead a cold accounting of every year of her marriage, the drunkenness and the whores, and the other name he cried aloud in his sleep, the name of a dead girl he had loved more than he had ever troubled to love his living wife. And she told him plainly that her children were golden and strong, and that they were the future of the realm, whether it pleased him or not. Robert listened to all of it, and something in him that might have reached for the hammer did not reach. He was disgusted, and he was tired, and he found that he could not bring himself to kill her, not because he forgave her, but because killing her would settle nothing and cost everything. He told her she would be sent back to her father in disgrace, stripped of her crown and her place, and that her children's fate would be decided by law and not by her scheming. And he turned and walked out without waiting for her answer, and the door closed behind him with the soft finality of a thing decided. In the lower halls, Jaime Lannister heard the shape of what had passed, and the Golden Knight's first thought was of steel. He knew where his sister was kept, and where the children slept, and he began, quietly and quickly, to seek out the Lannister guardsmen scattered through the keep, meaning to gather them and cut a path to his family, and out through some gate and away. But Robert's authority had been renewed the moment the whole court learned he lived, and Sir Barristan Selmy, grave and unhurried and utterly loyal, had already set the gold cloaks moving through the corridors with quiet purpose. One by one, the Lannister men in crimson were approached in narrow places and relieved of their arms before they understood what was happening. And when Jaime turned at last to rally them, he found only empty posts and closed doors and the calm faces of men who served the king. They came for him in the yard, a dozen of them, and Sir Barristan at their head. And the Kingslayer looked at the odds and the old knight's steady eyes and did not draw, and they escorted him to his own quarters and set a heavy guard upon the door. With the Kingslayer confined and the Lannister guardsmen disarmed, the tremor that had run through the Red Keep began to settle into an uneasy stillness, and it was in that stillness that Robert summoned those he trusted to a chamber high in the Tower of the Hand, where the shutters had been drawn against the noise of the city, and a fire burned low in the hearth despite the warmth of the season. The king lay propped upon cushions, his ruined thigh bound and splinted beneath a blanket, his great face pale, but his eyes clearer than they had been in years, as though the nearness of death had burned away some of the wine and left the man who had once won a kingdom on a battlefield. Ned stood at his side, still moving stiffly from his own healing wound, and near the door stood Sir Barristan, silver-haired and silent, his white cloak seeming to gather what little light there was. Renly had come dressed in green and gold, as always, restless and bright, and there was a fourth presence in the room that was no presence at all, only a folded letter bearing the crowned stag of Dragonstone sealed in dark wax, sent ahead by Stannis's own hand. Robert bade Ned read the letter aloud, and Ned did so in a voice that grew heavier with each line, for Stannis wrote as he lived, without warmth and without deceit, laying out in plain, cold words the truth they all now knew, that Cersei's 3 children had been fathered not by the king, but by her own brother, and that they were therefore no heirs at all but bastards born of incest, and that the crown must pass by ancient and unbending right to Stannis Baratheon as the eldest of the king's brothers and his lawful successor. There was no flattery in it, and no plea, only the assertion of a man who believed himself owed a thing and expected it to be given, and Robert's mouth twisted as he listened, for he had never loved his brother and liked him less with every year, seeing in that gaunt and joyless face a reproach he could not name. Renly spoke first when the reading was done, leaning forward with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted his own charm, and he said that there was another path entirely, that the marriage to Cersei was a poisoned thing that had given the realm nothing but a viper's brood, and that it might be set aside and annulled, the queen sent to some quiet cell or back to her father in disgrace. In her place, Renly urged, Robert might take Margaery Tyrell, the flower of Highgarden, young and lovely and untouched, and through her win not only true-born sons of the king's own blood, but the great wealth and vast armies of the Reach besides, binding the richest lands of the realm to the throne with a single vow. He spoke well and he spoke long, and there was truth in it, for the Reach could feed a kingdom and arm one, and a young queen might indeed give Robert the sons he had never truly had. But Ned listened to all of it with a growing unease, for he had seen too much of what ambition, unmoored from law, could do, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet and firm and carried the weight of the North in it. He said that a king who set aside one wife for advantage taught every lord in the realm that vows were things of convenience, and that the surest ground beneath any throne was not new marriages or new sons who might yet die in the cradle, but the plain observance of the law of succession that all men understood. Stannis was the heir, whether Robert loved him or no, and to name him openly and at once as heir presumptive would close every door through which a pretender might slip, would make plain to Lannister and Tyrell and Martell alike that there was no crown to be seized, only a lawful line to be honored. Do this, Ned pressed, and you spare the realm the very war that ambition is always eager to light. Robert scowled and shifted against his cushions and cursed his brother's cold heart, even as he heard the sense of it, and for a long while he said nothing at all, staring into the low flames while the fire crackled and Sir Barristan stood unmoving by the door. At last he growled that Ned was right. Curse him, that Stannis was the heir and always had been, and that the law was the law even when it handed the 7 kingdoms to a man with all the joy of a headsman's block. Yet he would not sign the decree that night, and he would not sign it the next, for some stubborn ember in him whispered that he was not so old, that a young wife might yet give him a son of his own body, and that there was no need to bind himself so soon to a future he despised. He would think on it, he said, and he would decide, and Ned understood with a sinking heart that a king who delayed a thing of such weight left a wound open through which many hands might reach. Beyond that shuttered chamber, the word was already running through King's Landing, like water finding every crack, that the Boar had not killed Robert after all, that the king lived, and the queen's children were bastards, and the Kingslayer sat under guard in his own rooms. In the shadowed passages beneath the keep, a soft-footed man in silken slippers heard each whisper as it came, and Varys, whose careful designs for a Targaryen restoration were crumbling around him with every hour that Robert breathed, sat alone in the flickering dark and weighed, very quietly, which of two paths might yet keep his head upon his shoulders. Far to the west of that shadowed keep, in the great fastness of Casterly Rock where the sea broke endlessly against the golden cliffs, and the halls had been carved from living stone by hands long turned to dust, another man received his own portion of the whispers that had begun to run through the realm. Tywin Lannister did not sit alone in the dark as Varys did, for he had never trusted the dark to keep his counsel. And so it was in a chamber bright with the last amber light of afternoon that Grand Maester Pycelle's raven found him, its message small and its weight beyond measure. He read it once, and then he read it again, and the parchment did not tremble in his hands, though the words upon it were the ruin of 40 years of patient labor. His grandchildren, the golden heirs he had schemed to seat upon the Iron Throne, were named bastards now in the mouths of common men. His daughter, whom he had raised to be a queen, was disgraced, and his firstborn son, the sword of his house, the beautiful and reckless Jaime, sat behind guarded doors in a distant city, a hostage in all but name. A lesser man might have wept, or raged, or dispatched a rider begging the king's forgiveness. Tywin Lannister did none of these things. He set the parchment down upon the table with a deliberate care that was itself a kind of violence, and he looked out through the tall window at the sea, and he began, slowly and coldly, to think. The insult was grievous, and the danger was greater still, for a king who could brand a queen and imprison the Warden of the West without a fight was a king who might reach for Lannister gold and Lannister blood next, and Tywin had not clawed his house back from the humiliation his own father had inflicted upon it, only to see it laid low again by the pride of a fat drunkard on a throne. He would not submit. That was decided in him before the light had shifted a hand's breadth across the floor. But neither would he strike openly, not yet, not while his son might be made to pay for it. And so he reached for the tool that lay ready to his hand, the great bloody-minded brute Gregor Clegane, whose riders had already been loosed upon the riverlands to draw the Tullys and their bannermen from their walls. The mountain's men were burning holdfasts and putting small folk to the sword along the Red Fork even now, and Tywin's host, 20,000 strong and mustered at the crossing near the Golden Tooth, had every pretext it required to remain in the field. He would not disband. When Robert's command came, as he knew it must, demanding that he scatter his levies and return to his rock like a chastened lord, Tywin would answer that the Riverlands were aflame with lawless raiders, and that a Warden of the West could scarcely be expected to leave the western borders undefended, while brigands ranged unchecked. It was a lie so thin that a child might see through it, and that was precisely the point, for a lie that fooled no one and yet could not be answered was the sharpest weapon of all. The command came, as he had foreseen, though it came in a form even Tywin had not quite expected. In the Red Keep, still weak but growing daily in strength and temper both, Robert Baratheon had heard of the lion's defiance and had roared himself hoarse over it, and then he had summoned his scribe and dictated a letter that Ned Stark, standing gray and grave at his side, had begged him to soften with every fiber of his weary honor. The letter stripped Cersei Lannister of her title and her station, It demanded that Jaime be sent north to take the black upon the wall, that his white cloak be traded for a black one, and his golden name buried in the frozen end of the world. And it summoned Tywin himself to court, to kneel before his king and answer for the raiding that even now scarred the Riverlands, as though the old lion could be called to heel like a hound that had strayed. "This is war," Ned had said quietly, when the scribe had gone. "You demand his son, his daughter's honor, and his own submission all at once, and you leave him no road that does not end in disgrace. A cornered lion does not lie down, Robert. He charges." But Robert's blood was up, and the fresh humiliation of a queen who had cuckolded him and a kingslayer who had polluted his line would not let him bend, and he told his old friend that Tywin Lannister would learn what it meant to defy the man he had put upon the throne. There was, moreover, the matter of the imp. Catelyn Stark, riding home along the high road weeks before, had seized upon Tyrion Lannister at a wayside inn and turned aside with him toward the Vale, her captive not yet delivered to any keep, to answer for a crime he had not committed, and Tywin had learned of it swiftly and had folded it into his tally of grievances with the ease of a man who had waited all his life for such gifts. Here was a second son taken by a Stark upon the open road, and if that was not cause enough to march, then no cause under heaven would ever be. Robert, seeing the peril too late, sent word that the imp be released at once, that Catelyn surrender her captive and defuse the thing before it caught fire. But the raven flew slowly, and the mountain rode swiftly, and along the banks of the Red Fork, the smoke was already climbing black into a summer sky. In the days that followed the smoke along the Red Fork, the Red Keep became a place of quiet reckoning, and Eddard Stark found himself summoned again and again to the king's chambers, where Robert stood before the great map that had been unrolled across the war table like a second skin flayed from the body of the realm. The candlelight threw long shadows across the painted rivers and holdfasts, and Robert traced the line of the trident with one thick finger as though he could feel the current beneath it, and he spoke of marching himself, of riding out at the head of his host, the way he had ridden years ago when the world was younger and his belly had not yet swelled with wine and grief. Yet even as war gathered its dark momentum, Robert turned to Ned with something gentler in his voice, an old warmth surfacing through the anger, and he pressed upon his friend a matter that had nothing to do with swords. He wanted the wolf to stay in the south. He spoke of a permanent seat upon the small council for House Stark, a chair that would never be emptied while the two great houses stood, and when Ned only lowered his eyes and said nothing, Robert went further and spoke of blood, of binding the Starks to the crown through more than the memory of a war they had fought together, through marriage and inheritance and the slow knitting of two families into one. Ned listened, and his heart ached with the old longing for the north, for the cold, clean air of Winterfell and the whisper of the Godswood, and he understood that whatever he chose, some part of himself would be left behind. To stay was to lose the north that had made him. To go was to lose the friend who had never asked so plainly for anything before. He did not answer that night, and he carried the weight of it through the shadowed corridors as he went to find another man entirely. Petyr Baelish kept his own hours and his own counsel, and Ned found him at last in a chamber lit by too many candles, a man whose smile arrived before his eyes did. Ned had learned enough by now to distrust that smile, and he set before Littlefinger the plain fact of his suspicion, that the master of coin served no master but his own advancement, that his loyalties shifted with the tide of advantage. Littlefinger did not deny it so much as fold it into flattery, protesting his devotion in words so smooth they left no purchase for the hand, and Ned departed no wiser and only wearier, unaware that he had confirmed the very thing he feared. For Petyr Baelish had watched the friendship between Robert and Ned harden into an alliance of iron, and he had understood, with the cold clarity that was his only faith, that a strong king and a strong hand, standing shoulder to shoulder, left no crack for a small man to climb. Chaos was the ladder he had always meant to climb, and chaos was precisely what an unbroken alliance denied him. So he set himself, in the quiet way of a man who never lifted his own hand where a whispered word would serve, to prolong the coming war and to feed it. He found Robert's rage and warmed himself beside it, murmuring in the king's ear of Lannister arrogance and Lannister treachery, encouraging every harsher instinct, praising the wisdom of teaching Casterly Rock a lesson it would remember for 100 years. A short war ended in reconciliation would ruin him. A long war of grinding attrition might yet leave the board scattered enough for a clever man to rearrange the pieces. Robert, for his part, felt none of the poison in the honey he was fed, and in the days before the host was ready, he did a thing that surprised even himself. He named Eddard Stark warden of the realm's justice in his own stead, should the king ride to war in person, granting his friend the whole authority of the Iron Throne over every matter of law and mercy within the Seven Kingdoms. It was a trust such as no man had been given in living memory, and when Robert made the declaration before the council, his voice cracked with something that was not quite grief and not quite love, but partook of both. That night, the two of them sat alone in the king's chambers with a flagon between them, and for the first time in all the long years, Robert spoke of Lyanna without the wine turning his words to bile. He asked Ned to tell him again how she had died, and Ned told him what he had told him before, of the bed of blood and the promise wrung from him in a tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne, and something in the telling loosened a knot in Robert that had been tied since he was a young man, and the two old friends found their way, at long last, to a true and quiet reconciliation. Yet even in that gentleness, Ned held his silence about the deepest thing of all. He watched Robert's eyes as the king spoke of the Targaryens with undimmed hatred, of dragon spawn and the mercy of the sword, and he knew with a certainty that turned his blood to river ice that this Robert, living and hungry for war, would never suffer a single drop of that blood to draw breath. The boy he called his own bastard slept safe at Winterfell only because the world believed a lie, and Ned understood, sitting there in the warm confidence of his king, that the truth of Jon Snow could purchase nothing but a small grave, and so he swallowed it down, though he knew a secret kept from a living king was a fire that might yet find its own air, and smiled and let his friend believe that between them nothing remained unspoken at all. The morning that Robert Baratheon chose to ride west was cold and bright, the kind of clear Crownlands dawn that made the mud of the yard steam faintly as the sun climbed, and the king stood in the great courtyard of the Red Keep, with his armor half buckled and his eyes fixed on the western road, as though he could already see the banners of the lions waiting for him beyond the horizon. Ned had argued against it through the whole of the night, his voice low and steady in the way of a man who knew he had already lost, reminding Robert of the wound that had nearly claimed him, of the fever that had left him gaunt beneath his bulk, of the simple truth that kings did not need to fight their own battles to win them. Yet Robert would not be moved, for the Boar had taken something from him that he meant to take back, and he could not take it back from a throne. "I have sat still and grown fat, and let other men do my killing for years," he said, and there was in his voice not the old thunder, but something quieter and more dangerous, the resolve of a man bargaining with his own mortality. "I will not die in a bed, Ned. If I am to go, let it be with a hammer in my hand, and men who remember what I was." So Ned gave him his blessing, reluctant and grieving, and turned instead to the work that would keep his friend alive as long as any man could: the unglamorous labor of grain and wagons, and the counting of horses, the arithmetic of war that no singer ever set to verse. While Robert rode out with the sun on his crowned helm and the crownlands rising to his banner in a great glad roar, Ned remained behind, bent over maps and ledgers, calculating the miles between the granaries of the Reach and the mouths that would need feeding, arranging the barges that would carry salt beef and hard bread up the rivers to a marching host. And it was this quiet toil, unseen and unsung, that would prove as deadly to House Lannister as any hammer. For the marching of a king changed everything, and Tywin Lannister understood it before the tidings had even finished spreading through his camps. He had built his war upon a simple and terrible foundation: that a boy sat the Iron Throne with wolves clutching at his shoulder, that the realm was leaderless and confused, that a lord of the West might reach out and take what disorder offered. But there was no boy now. There was Robert, alive, crowned, the storm god of the trident come again with his warhammer swinging. And against such a man, Tywin could claim nothing but rebellion, naked and unadorned. The bannermen who had come to him half-willing, the river lords bought with fear, and the Wester lords who trusted his gold above his cause, began to feel the ground shift beneath them, for it was one thing to fight a usurper, and another entirely to lift a sword against a king proven in battle, anointed and beloved, whose face they had cheered in their own halls. Word came to Tywin in his tent by candlelight that a lesser house had slipped away in the night, and then another, and the old lion sat unmoving in his camp chair and understood that he had been forced onto ground he had never meant to hold. Kevin Lannister met the royal host in the field where the Red Fork bent through low hills, and the battle that followed was the sort that men would speak of for the rest of their lives with a kind of awe that had no room in it for joy. The two armies came together in the gray light of a clouded afternoon, and for a long while the lines heaved and buckled without breaking, until Robert found the seam he had been hunting for, the place on the Lannister left where a young knight's courage had outrun his sense. The king drove into it with his household men behind him, and those who saw it said afterward that they had watched a legend take flesh, that Robert Baratheon, at the head of that charge, was larger than a mortal man, his hammer rising and falling with a sound like the felling of trees, scattering armored knights as a storm scatters gulls. The Lannister flank folded and then broke, and the day turned upon that single terrible surge, and the field was won. Yet victory in war is never clean, and the cost of it was written in Robert's own flesh before the sun had set. A spear had found the gap beneath his arm in the press, a wound not mortal but deep and slow to close, and by nightfall the king lay pale upon his cot, with the maesters clustered around him, and his breath coming shallow, his great body already too worn to give back easily what the battle had taken. Ned's careful barges reached the camp that same evening, laden with bread, while beyond the hills the western host went hungry, their supply lines fraying with each mile they retreated, and in the flush of triumph there were few who marked how thin the king had grown, how the wound seemed to sit heavier on him than such a wound should sit on any man. In his tent, Robert laughed weakly at the maester's grave face and asked for wine, and the men outside heard him and took heart, believing their king invincible. But a rider was already spurring hard for King's Landing through the dark, with a sealed message for the hand, and the words within it, when Ned broke the seal by candlelight, would tell him that Robert had won his battle and might yet lose his life to it. far from the muddy fields where Robert had bled for his crown. The golden lion of House Lannister sat in a chamber that was neither cell nor comfort, kept beneath the red keep in a room where the light fell through a single narrow window in a slow amber bar that crept across the stones from morning until dusk. Jaime Lannister had learned the length of that bar the way a sailor learns the tides, marking his hours by the way it climbed the far wall and thinned to nothing when the sun sank behind the city. He was no longer chained, for the war had turned, and there was little need to fear a man whose house was losing. But the door was barred from without, and 2 guardsmen stood beyond it, and the silence that pressed upon him in those long afternoons was a heavier weight than any iron he had worn. He was thinking of nothing in particular when they brought him word that the Hand would see him, and something in the tone of the summons told him this would not be the usual sparring, the usual careful contempt that Eddard Stark carried into every meeting, like a man carrying a lamp into a room he did not wish to see clearly. When Ned came, he did not come alone, and he did not come to threaten. He laid the terms upon the table between them plainly, a man who took no pleasure in the offer he was compelled to make, and the terms were these: that Jaime Lannister might take the Black and go north to the Wall, and by his going help unmake the war that his family had begun, or that he might refuse, and watch from behind his bars while his father was ground down mile by mile and his sister was brought before a court to answer for treason with her life the forfeit. Jaime listened with his hands folded and his face composed in the easy insolence that had served him for 20 years. But the insolence was a shell now, and he knew it, and he suspected the Stark knew it too. To take the Black was to lose everything a man might be, to shed name and inheritance, and the woman he had loved since before he understood the word, and to gain in return nothing but the cold and the endless duty of a wall at the edge of the world. Yet as he sat there in the amber light, he found that the loss frightened him less than it should have, and the thing that frightened him instead was how little the name he was surrendering had ever truly been his own. Kingslayer. They had called him for half his life, and he had worn the word like armor and hated it like a wound, and he was so very tired of being the thing that single word had made of him. It was into this uncertainty that Cersei's message came, smuggled to him folded small within a heel of bread by a servant who did not meet his eyes, and he unfolded it by the last of the day's light and read his sister's hand and felt the ground shift beneath him. She urged him to fight. She urged him to swear whatever oath they asked, and to break it the moment his boots were beyond the gate, to promise the Wall and take the road south instead, to lie to the Stark's grave honest face and laugh at him after. She wrote of burning them all if it came to that, of the wildfire beneath the city, of ruin preferred to surrender, and her words were so entirely without hesitation that they chilled him more than the stone at his back. He had known her ruthlessness always, and had loved it as he loved the whole of her, but reading it now, alone, offered so freely as a plan of escape, he saw for the first time the shape of what their love had made them, 2 halves of a single hunger that had devoured everything it touched, and he understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, that he did not want to be that thing any longer. When they brought him again before the Hand, he did not swear the false oath, and he did not accept the Black. He set the folded message upon the table where Ned could see it, and he said that his father could not win this war, that no clever campaign and no starving march could restore a cause once a true king had put himself at the head of the enemy, and that Tywin Lannister, whatever else the world said of him, was too cold a mind to spend his house upon a dead ambition. He offered instead to carry a truce to Casterly Rock, a genuine one, terms his father might accept, without the sword to his throat. And he offered it, not as a trick, but as the only honest thing he had left to give. Ned Stark studied him across that table for a long moment, and the Northern Lord who had judged the Kingslayer as oath-breaking to his marrow, who had carried that judgment for years as a settled and comfortable truth, found himself uncertain for the first time. For there was no cunning in the offer that he could find, only a weariness that looked very much like honesty. He asked why a man should trust the word of one who had broken so many, and Jaime answered that he should not, that he could send whatever hostage or witness he pleased, that the truce would carry its own proof in whether Tywin took it or refused. The candle guttered between them, and neither man spoke, and in that silence, something old began quietly to change. The truce made its slow way westward along the river road, carried by riders who changed horses at every holdfast, and it reached Casterly Rock on a gray afternoon when the sea beneath the great cliff lay flat and colorless as beaten pewter. Tywin Lannister read it in the long hall where the golden lion hung across the wall behind his seat, and he read it twice, and then a third time, and those who attended him saw nothing in his face but the same stillness he wore at feasts and at funerals alike, the stillness of a man who had learned decades ago that a lord's expression was itself a weapon, and never spent it cheaply. He set the parchment upon the arm of his chair and looked out through the high windows toward the water, and he said nothing for a very long while. He was not a man given to hoping, and so he did not hope now, but he weighed. The letters upon the table beneath his hand told their own quiet story, and it was not a story he cared for. Lords who had ridden to his banner with loud oaths had grown careful in their words of late, phrasing their loyalty in the conditional, mentioning their aging fathers and their untended lands, and the wisdom of prudence, and Tywin understood the language of men edging toward a door. Robert Baratheon lived. That was the whole of it, the single stone upon which every calculation now rested. For a war against a dead king wearing a boy's crown was one thing, a war of ambition dressed as loyalty, but a war against a living crowned king who had bled for his throne and risen from the bed men had already mourned him in. That was treason plain and unadorned, and treason was a coin that bought a house nothing but its own ending. He thought of his grandchildren, the golden children in the capital whose parentage the whole realm now whispered of, and he felt no warmth, only the cold arithmetic of a line that might yet be salvaged or might be cut away entire, depending upon how he moved in the coming days. A house was not its present. A house was its future, the sons yet unborn, the marriages yet unmade, the long patient reach of blood across generations, and Tywin Lannister had spent his whole life tending that reach, as a gardener tends a slow and difficult tree. He would not burn the orchard to spite a single season. So he rode east under a banner of peace, and beneath a canvas pavilion pitched upon a low hill, where the two hosts could each see the other, and neither could pretend at surprise. Tywin Lannister and Robert Baratheon met at last across a plain trestle table set with bread and salt and a jug of wine that neither man touched. Robert had come thinner than the songs remembered him, the scar of the boar's tusk still livid along his side beneath his tunic, and there was a steadiness in him that had not been there in years. For Ned Stark sat at his right hand, and Ned Stark's counsel had settled over the king like a hand upon a restive horse. Robert did not roar. He did not threaten. He laid out his terms in a low, even voice, and it was the evenness that unsettled Tywin more than any fury could have done. Cersei would not die. That was the first mercy, and it was offered not from tenderness but from wisdom, for a queen executed makes martyrs and grudges that outlast the man who ordered the axe. And so she would be given the choice of the Silent Sisters, or exile across the narrow sea, her name struck from the succession, but her breath left in her body. The children would be stripped of the Baratheon name and the crown that was never theirs, but they would be spared, sent to fosterage far from the capital, where no one would think to lift a knife against them. Casterly Rock would pay an indemnity so vast it would strain even the gold of the West, and Tywin would disband his host and send his lords home to their lands, and House Lannister would keep its seat and its wealth and its ancient dignity, diminished but whole. Tywin listened without moving, and when Robert had finished, he was silent for the space of many breaths, and Ned Stark watched him and saw the thing he had expected, which was not gratitude and not relief, but a swift and total reckoning behind the pale green eyes, the sum of 100 variables resolving into a single answer. Then Tywin inclined his head, no more than a lord acknowledging a peer, and he said that the terms were accepted, that House Lannister would bend the knee and pay what was owed and keep the king's peace, and his voice was as flat and cold as the sea beneath his castle. But even as he spoke the words that ended the war, another thought moved beneath them, quiet and patient and utterly without heat, for Tywin Lannister had never in his life mistaken a truce for a defeat. There were daughters in other houses, and sons who would need wives, and the new order Robert built would have seams in it, as every order did, places where a marriage cleverly made might one day slip a Lannister hand back toward the levers of the realm. He had a granddaughter of his own blood to think of, and lesser cousins, and time, and gold enough still to purchase patience. He rose from the table and bowed to his king, and behind that bow a design was already taking shape, its first thread reaching quietly toward a match no one at that table would think to guard against, a design that would in time be uncovered and undone, but only after it had cost the crown dearly. The war had ended, and yet the hardest question of all remained unanswered, waiting in the quiet of the small council chamber, where Robert sat with his fingers pressed against the arm of his chair and his gaze fixed on nothing. There were 3 children in the Red Keep whose very existence had become a wound the realm did not know how to close, 3 golden-haired sons, and a daughter who bore the Baratheon name, and none of the Baratheon blood, and what became of them now rested entirely upon a man who had spent his whole life avoiding decisions that could not be solved with a hammer. Ned came to him in the gray hour before the court gathered, and he did not raise his voice, for he had never needed to when speaking of the things that mattered most to him. He said that the children had done no wrong that any court could name, that they had been born into a lie they had never chosen, and that to spill their blood would be to answer one crime with a greater one. He reminded Robert of the 2 Targaryen infants, whose deaths had been laid at the foot of the throne years before, the wrapped bodies presented as trophies, and he watched his old friend flinch at the memory even now. Robert listened, and something in him that had lain dormant through years of wine and feasting and forgetting stirred slowly toward the surface, for he had come very near to death himself in the tusks of a boar, and a man who has felt the cold breath of his own ending looks differently upon the endings of others. When Robert finally spoke, his voice was rough and tired, and he said that he would not become the sort of king who murdered children to secure a throne he had never much wanted in the first place. He would strip them of every claim, every title, every drop of the inheritance that had never truly been theirs, but he would not take their lives, and in saying so he felt not triumph, but a heavy and unfamiliar peace, as though he had at last done one thing that Ned Stark might carry into the memory of him without shame. The confrontation with Joffrey came later, and it was as ugly as anything the war itself had produced. The boy stood in the center of the chamber, with his chin lifted and his mouth twisted into that expression of wounded entitlement that Cersei had spent 13 years mistaking for pride. And when Robert told him plainly what would become of him, that he would sit no throne, wear no crown, hold no lands, and live out his days under wardship far from any lever of power, Joffrey's composure shattered into something that made even the guards along the walls go still. He spat threats and promises of vengeance. He named men he would have flayed and women he would have burned, and he swore that when he was grown, he would return and hang every traitor in that room. And Robert, hearing it, ordered him sent to the wall's black cells, or the silent quiet of a septry, where an oath would bind what mercy could not from the walls of the city. And all the while his voice rose to a shrill and childish pitch that stripped away whatever menace his words might otherwise have carried. Robert watched him, and for the first time he truly saw the thing that had grown in the shadow of his neglect and his wife's ruinous indulgence. The boy who had been given everything and taught to value nothing, and a bitter and bottomless relief settled over him that this creature would never sit where kings had sat. He gave the order in a quiet voice that Joffrey be confined under strict and gentle wardship, watched at every hour, permitted no weapons, and no dominion over any living thing. And as the guards led the shrieking boy from the chamber, Robert did not look away, for he understood that this ruin was in some measure his own making, and that a man ought at least to have the courage to witness what his failures had built. With the younger children, it was another matter entirely, and here the mercy came easier to all of them. Myrcella was brought before the council with her hands folded and her eyes wide and frightened, a girl of no cruelty and no ambition, who had never asked to be born to the mother she had, and Robert's voice softened as he spoke of her. She would be sent south to Dorne, into the household of the Martells, where a quiet arrangement had been struck that would give her a life of comfort and safety far from the currents of the succession. And though it was a kind of exile, it was also a kindness, for in Dorne she would be a guest and not a hostage, a girl allowed to grow into a woman in the warm light of the orange groves, rather than the cold intrigues of the capital. Tommen was gentlest of all, a small round boy who loved his kittens more than he had ever loved the idea of a crown. And when he was told he would go to the Reach to be fostered among the vast and green estates of the south, he asked only whether he might bring his cats, and the question undid something in Robert that all the war's savagery had left untouched. He knelt, this great ruined mountain of a king, and told the boy that he might bring every cat in the Red Keep if he wished, and the sight of it stayed with every man present long after. Yet even as these gentle fates were spoken into being, in a chamber elsewhere in the keep a raven was being prepared, and where it flew and what it stirred would trouble the peace before the year was out. The dissolution of a royal marriage was a thing of great delicacy, and Robert had never in his life been a delicate man, so it fell to others to arrange the careful unmaking of what had been bound before gods and men so many years before. The High Septon was summoned, an old and heavy man whose robes seemed to bear him down more than his years did, and he came into the small council chamber with the reluctant tread of one who understood that he was being asked to bless something that convenience rather than conscience required. There were arguments made and precedents cited, and the matter of true-born heirs was raised, without ever quite naming the shape of the doubt that lay beneath it. For Robert had sons and a daughter, yet no longer any he wished to call his own, and the crown required an heir whose blood no man could question. In the end, the Septon gave his word, and the marriage that had joined stag to lion was set aside with the quiet finality of a door closing in a distant part of a great house, heard by all, yet witnessed by none. Cersei was gone from the capital by then, sent north under guard to a keep where she might be watched and kept and slowly forgotten, and the absence of her allowed the court to breathe in a way it had not for many years. Into that cleared air came the Tyrells, riding up the King's Road in a procession so laden with wealth and green banners that the small folk lined the streets simply to stare at the wonder of it. Marjorie came at the head of them, young and lovely, and possessed of a warmth that seemed entirely genuine and yet lost nothing of its careful cultivation. And when she was presented to Robert, she looked upon the ruin of the man the boar had made, and did not flinch, but smiled, as though she saw the king he might yet become, rather than the wreckage that stood before her. It was Olenna who did the true work, of course, the old woman they called the Queen of Thorns, settling herself into a chair in the council chamber, as though she had always belonged there, and negotiating each concession with a dry precision that left even Robert's clever new advisors gasping in her wake. The Reach would give its daughter, and with her, its gold and its granaries, and the vast host that made it the richest of the 7 kingdoms, and in return, the Tyrells would have positions and honors, and a place at the very heart of the realm. And Olenna named each of these prices with such offhand certainty that the giving of them seemed less a bargain than a simple recognition of the order of things. Loras was made a knight of the Kingsguard, and the young man knelt to take his white cloak with a grace that made the whole court fall silent to watch him, for he was beautiful in the way that legends were beautiful, and men spoke of him afterward as the brightest star to rise in that hall in a generation. Renly moved through all of it like a man who had woken to find his dreams made real without the cost he had feared to pay. He had wanted this match, had schemed toward it in the shadows of another life, and now it came to him, not as the fruit of rebellion, but as the natural gift of a brother's need, and his influence rose upon the tide of the Tyrell alliance, without a single sword being drawn, or a single lie being told. He laughed more easily in those days, and the laughter was a good sound in the halls of the Red Keep, and Robert, watching his younger brother flourish, felt something he had thought long dead stir warmly in his battered chest. Yet amid the feasting, and the alliances, and the reshaping of the balance of the great houses, one man among them grew quieter with each passing day. Ned Stark had done what he came south to do, and more besides, for he had helped a king survive and a realm settle, and an order take root that promised peace. And now his heart turned northward, as surely as a needle turns toward the cold. He thought of Catelyn and of the children he had not held in too long, of Winterfell's gray stone, and the Godswood, where the old gods still whispered in the leaves. And one evening, he came to Robert in the king's private chambers and asked, plainly and without ceremony, for leave to go home. Robert set down the cup he had been holding, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, only looked at the one man in all the world he trusted without reservation. "You would leave me," he said at last, and there was no anger in it, only a weariness that ran deeper than the wounds the boar had given him. "The realm is stable, Robert," Ned answered gently. "Your marriage is made, your alliances are secured, and the North has been too long without its lord." The king rose then, moving with the slow care of a body that would never again be whole, and he laid one heavy hand upon Ned's shoulder. "One more year," he said. "Stay one more year and see this new thing rooted. For it is young yet, and I am not so strong as I was, and there is no other man alive whose word I would rather have at my side." Ned looked at him, at the honest need in that ruined face, and though every part of his heart pulled him toward the snow and the pines and the wife who waited, he bowed his head and gave his word to stay. The letters came south with the first hard frosts, borne by ravens that beat against a gray sky heavy with the promise of winter. They arrived at the Red Keep in a modest bundle sealed with black wax, and in another year, in a realm sundered by war and ambition, they might have been set aside unread among 100 more pressing concerns. Ned Stark did not set them aside. He carried them himself to the small solar, where the morning light fell thin and pale across the flagstones, and he read them slowly, one after another, and the reading of them settled a cold weight into his chest that had nothing to do with the season. The words were the plain, unadorned words of men who had spent their lives at the edge of the world. There were disappearances among the wildlings, whole villages abandoned, hearths gone cold with the pots still hanging above them. There were folk fleeing south toward the wall, in numbers not seen in living memory, and rangers who went out beyond the trees and did not come back, and among the older brothers, a fear that had no name they were willing to write down in a letter. The Lord Commander wrote of dwindling stores and crumbling towers, and a garrison stretched so thin across the leagues of the wall that whole castles stood empty and dark. He wrote as a man writes who has grown weary of writing and expects no answer. Ned had spent his boyhood in the shadow of that ancient ice, and he knew the men of the Watch to be many things, some of them thieves, and some of them worse. But he did not think them fools, and he did not think them prone to fancy. He brought the letters to Robert that same afternoon, spreading them upon the table between them, and he spoke of what he had read while the king listened with his one good hand curled around a cup he did not drink from. "They have written before," Robert said at last. "My whole reign they have written, begging for men and coin, and I gave them neither, and the wall still stands." But there was less certainty in the words than there might once have been, for the man who spoke them was not the man who had ridden to that boar hunt, and the long, slow months of his mending had taught him something of patience and something of listening. He looked at the letters, at the cramped black script, and he looked at Ned's face, which he had never once known to wear fear without cause. "They ask for little enough," Ned said. "Men who would otherwise rot in the black cells. Grain we can spare with the harvest come in. Coin to shore up what is falling. It is a small price against a thing we do not understand." And because the realm was at peace, because there was no war to swallow every man and every copper, because the king had learned to trust the counsel of the one friend who had never lied to him, Robert did a thing he had never done in all the years of his reign. He gave the order to send north. Far away, in the cold that Ned only remembered and the king had never known, the news came slowly up the King's Road, and slower still along the frozen path to Castle Black. And when it came, the older brothers of the Watch did not quite know what to make of it. Maester Aemon received it in his chambers, his blind eyes turned toward a warmth he could feel but never see, and when the words were read aloud to him, his ancient hands went still upon the arms of his chair. A living king, he thought, a king at peace, a king who listens. In all his long years, he had watched the realm turn its face from the north again and again, had watched warning after warning fall like snow upon deaf stone, and here at last was a thread of something he had almost forgotten how to feel. It was not certainty. It was too fragile a thing for that, but it was hope, and hope was more than the Watch had held in a generation. Jon Snow felt the changed wind in a manner all his own. Word reached him, quiet and careful, that his father's hand had grown long and steady in the south, that a king who owed Ned Stark his very life might be moved to release a boy from a vow spoken in the hot pride of youth, or to see him settled elsewhere with honor and a name that was not the name of a bastard. It was a thing that had never been possible before, and its very possibility undid something in him that he had thought was closed forever. He stood upon the wall in the failing light, with the cold pressing against his face like a hand, and he looked out over the endless dark forest that ran to the roof of the world, and he weighed the two lives that lay before him. There was the life he had chosen, the Black Cloak and the Frozen Brotherhood, and the vow that took no wife and held no lands. And there was the other life, the one the war had never let his fellows imagine, a road back to the world with his father's love to light it. Ghost pressed warm against his leg, and somewhere below, a horn sounded once, low and long, calling the rangers in from the gathering dusk, and Jon found that he did not know his own heart, and that the not knowing frightened him more than the darkness beyond the trees ever had. Far to the south, where the sea wind carried the salt smell of the Blackwater up through the crooked streets of King's Landing, another man weighed lives against one another, though he did so in a manner altogether colder and more considered than the boy upon the wall. Varys, whom men called the Spider, moved through the Red Keep in his soft slippers, as he had always moved, silent and smiling and seemingly harmless. But behind the powder and the perfume, his thoughts turned upon a loom that had, without his willing it, begun to unravel. For years he had woven a single grand design, patient as any craftsman, and at the heart of that design lay a simple and terrible arithmetic. A realm at peace with itself had no hunger for a savior from across the sea, and so his labors had always depended, in some quiet corner of his reckoning, upon the coming of chaos. A king who drank himself toward an early grave, a widow with ambitions larger than her wit, a succession disputed and bloody, lords tearing at one another like dogs over a carcass, and out of that ruin, a Targaryen prince might sail home to a people weary of misrule and eager for the old blood to set things right again. That had been the shape of the thing in his mind, and he had tended it as a gardener tends a slow-growing tree. Now the tree was failing, and Varys knew it, and the knowing sat in him like a stone he could not swallow. Robert Baratheon had not died. The Boar had opened him, and the fever had nearly taken him, and the maesters had murmured their prayers over his fevered bulk. And yet the man had risen from that bed, changed, twice wounded now, twice returned from the very edge, and something in him had settled that had never been settled before. The stag no longer raged. He drank less, he listened more, and the realm, sensing the change in its master, had begun to breathe easier, and an easier realm was the one thing Varys could not use. The eunuch stood at a narrow window in the small hours and looked down upon the sleeping city, and he considered what it meant, that his great engine of disorder had ground itself still. He had spent a lifetime learning that men were moved by fear and hunger and grievance, and that a contented people were the deadest of soil for the seeds he wished to plant. Across the narrow sea, the Targaryen girl had been given to a horse lord, wed beneath the open sky to a man whose people counted their wealth in horses and slaves and were said to fear the salt sea, as other men feared fire, and once such news would have set the council howling for blood. Varys turned the tidings over in his mind and wondered, for the first time in many years, whether the peace he had guarded so carefully across the water was a peace he could still play at all. The council heard of the marriage on a gray morning, when the light came thin and cold through the high windows of the chamber, and Robert surprised them all. Grand Maester Pycelle spoke of the danger, of the horde of 40,000 screamers such a union might one day summon, and Littlefinger offered his silken calculations, and Varys watched the king's face and waited for the old fury, the roar and the pounding fist, and the cry for a knife in the dark. It did not come. The king sat heavy in his chair with one leg stiff before him and his ruined side held carefully. and he looked at the map spread upon the table for a long while before he spoke. "A girl," he said at last, and there was weariness in it, but not the drunken weariness of before, rather the weariness of a man who had lain twice at death's door and come to know the weight of a life. "A girl sold to a savage across the world. I have hated that name for 20 years. I have wanted every last one of them dead so badly I could taste it, like copper on the tongue." He shifted, and the scar pulled at him, and he grimaced. "But I am tired of tasting it. Send no knife, send a letter." Yet across the sea, a girl still walked toward fire and eggs of stone, and whether an open hand could reach her before the dragons woke was a thing no man in that room could know. The chamber went very still, and Varys felt his own smooth mask hold fast, even as something behind it startled awake. Robert spoke on, slowly, feeling his way toward a thought that the man he had once been could never have entertained, that a realm grown stable could afford the luxury of patience, that a girl reconciled cost less than a girl made martyr, that reaching across the water with an open hand might do what 100 hired blades could never do. He would open a channel, quiet and unofficial, a merchant's word carried by a merchant's ship, and he would see whether the last Targaryen might one day be brought home, not as a conqueror, but as a subject who had no cause left to hate him. Varys bowed and murmured his approval, and inwardly he understood that the ground had shifted beneath his feet in a way he had not foreseen. No assassin would sail east now, and so no clumsy poisoner's plot would set in motion the chain of small catastrophes that might otherwise have wounded the Horse Lord and altered the girl's slow, strange path toward whatever waited for her in the wide and burning east. The seeds of dragons still lay somewhere in the sand and the dark, and whether they would wake in time to burn for the living or too late to matter was a wager the West could not afford to lose, but they grew now, unshaped by the death that had never happened, and the eunuch, walking softly back to his chambers, began at last to consider whether his life's whole design might need to be rewoven from the very first thread. The year that followed should have settled over the realm like snow, and yet it did not settle easily, for the removal of Littlefinger tore open ledgers that named lords no one had suspected, and the court spent that winter learning which of its own had been for sale, softening the sharp edges of all that had passed, and drawing a quiet over the land that few had dared to hope for. There were no armies marching along the King's Road, no ravens screaming warning between the great houses, no smoke rising from burning holdfasts to stain the pale winter sky. Men who had spent the summer clutching swords in the dark now returned to their fields and their forges, and the harvest came in slow and steady, and the taverns of King's Landing filled once more with the low murmur of ordinary complaint rather than the sharp whisper of fear. It was a peace, and yet it was not a peace that rested easy, for beneath its calm surface ran currents that no eye at court could see all at once, and those who watched most closely understood that a settled realm is not the same as a healed one. At Casterly Rock, far to the west where the great gray lion stood carved into the living cliff above the churning sea, Cersei Lannister paced the halls of her childhood like a beast returned to a cage it had long since outgrown. She had come home not in triumph but in disgrace, her marriage quietly dissolved, her son stripped of the crown he had never truly held, her own name spoken in the capital with a pity that was worse to her than hatred. Each morning she woke to the same gray light through the same high windows, and each morning she felt the humiliation settle into her bones a little deeper, and she filled the long empty hours with small schemes and pettier vengeances, dismissing servants who had served her father faithfully, poisoning the ears of visiting lords with half-truths about the king in the east, nursing a grievance that had no outlet and so turned inward and grew rancid. Tywin watched his daughter with eyes that had gone flat and cold, and in those eyes she read not sympathy, but disappointment. The disappointment of a man who had built his house across a lifetime only to see its foundations cracked by the recklessness of his own blood. Yet Tywin did not rage, for rage was the weapon of lesser men, and he had never been a lesser man. He set himself instead to the patient work of rebuilding, calling in old debts and forging new alliances, replenishing the treasury the war had drained, and quietly restoring the strength of Lannister arms without ever once appearing to threaten the crown. He did not reconcile himself to what had happened, not truly, for a wound, to the pride of Tywin Lannister, did not close as ordinary wounds closed, but he understood the value of time as few men living understood it, and so he bided, and he built, and he waited for a season that had not yet come. In the capital, another man found the peace far less to his liking, for Petyr Baelish had always thrived in the churning waters of discord, and the still pool the realm had become gave him nothing to fish in. He moved as he had always moved, softly and by indirection, whispering to this lord and lending coin to that one, seeking the small fractures he might widen into fissures, testing the mortar of the new order for any stone that might be pried loose. But he had misjudged the changed shape of the board, for the eunuch who had once been his rival in the shadows now served the crown with a devotion born not of loyalty to any man, but of a colder calculation about what the coming years would require, and Varys had grown weary of the little mockingbird's ceaseless appetite for ruin. Piece by piece he gathered the evidence of Baelish's manipulations, the doctored ledgers and the borrowed daggers, and the letters written in careful hands that were not quite disguised well enough. And when he had gathered enough, he laid it before the king and the hand, together in the small council chamber one gray afternoon, and there was no thunder in it, only the quiet, damning weight of proof. Littlefinger stood before them with his familiar half-smile still fixed upon his lips, and he spoke smoothly of misunderstanding and of enemies who wished him harm. But Ned Stark looked upon him with the plain northern eyes that had never learned to lie and had never learned to abide a lie, and Robert, heavier now and slower but no fool, saw the truth in the eunuch's papers and the guilt beneath the smile. There was no trial in the great sense, no headsman upon the steps of the sept, for a man like Baelish was too dangerous to make a martyr of, and too useful in his knowledge to simply cast away. And so the reckoning came in quieter form, a stripping of his offices, a seizing of his brothels and his ledgers, and a passage arranged upon a ship bound east under guard, an exile dressed in the clothing of a diplomatic errand from which few expected he would return, and with his going the last hand that might have reached out to unmake the settlement was gently, firmly removed from the board, and the new order, which had stood upon uncertain ground for a year, felt at last the solid earth beneath it. But even as the realm steadied, its king was failing. The boar's tusk had opened him once, and steel had opened him a second time in the days of the near war, and the long years of wine and feasting and neglect had opened him 100 quiet times besides, and no measure of Marjorie's patient care could wholly close what had been so long undone. He drank less now, far less than the man he had been, and in the drinking's place had come a strange reflectiveness, a settling of the spirit that those who had known him young would scarcely have recognized. He spent his evenings with Ned before the fire in the small solar, the two old friends passing the hours in memory, recalling the rebellion and the trident and the boys they once had been. And one such night, more than a year after the wedding feast, with the flames low and his voice grown soft, Robert set down his cup and confessed the fear that had ridden him for months, the fear of dying, with no proven heir of his body to hold the peace they had bought so dearly. Ned was still framing his answer when the door opened and Marjorie entered with a light upon her face that neither man had seen there before. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded lightly over the swell of her belly, and though she said nothing at first, the light in her eyes spoke plainly enough that Robert rose from his chair before she had crossed the threshold. She told them then, in a voice that trembled between joy and awe, that the maesters had confirmed the child within her, and that they had warned her too of the danger the birth might bring to a king so worn and a father so old. Robert stood before her as a man struck dumb, his great hands hanging useless at his sides, and Ned watched the years fall away from his friend's face in a single unguarded moment, saw beneath the ruin of feasting and grief the boy who had once laughed on the road to River Run with the whole world before him. The months that followed passed in a hush of guarded hope. The Red Keep, which had known so many false triumphs and hollow celebrations, seemed to hold its breath, and even the servants moved through the corridors with a softer tread, as though loud footfalls might disturb the fragile thing taking shape in the Queen's chambers. Marjorie grew heavy and radiant, tended day and night by her grandmother and her ladies, and Robert hovered at the edges of her care like a man unaccustomed to gentleness, forbidden from the birthing rooms by custom, yet unable to keep himself far from the door. The Tyrells sent word to Highgarden and to every holdfast between the Reach and the capital, and across the realm, men who had lived their whole lives under the shadow of an uncertain succession dared to speak aloud of a peace that might outlast the king himself. The child came in the deep cold before dawn, in the hour when the torches burn lowest, and the world seems suspended between the night that has passed and the day not yet begun. Robert waited in the corridor outside with Ned beside him, and the two of them heard the Queen's cries through the thick oaken door, and then, after an eternity that could not have been more than an hour, they heard another sound entirely, thin and furious and alive, the first indignant wail of a newborn drawing breath. When the door opened and the old maester emerged with his sleeves still rolled and his hands newly washed, he told the king that he had a son, a boy hale and whole and loud enough to wake the dead, and Robert Baratheon, who had faced the trident and the boar and the long, slow dying of his own body without flinching, wept where he stood. They brought the child out swaddled in cloth of gold, and Robert took him into his arms with a care that seemed impossible for hands so large and so accustomed to violence. He held the boy against his chest and looked down into the small, crumpled face, and Ned, watching from a pace behind, understood that this was the true ending of something that had begun on the road years before, the closing of a wound that had festered since Robert first learned the children he called his own carried no drop of his blood. The king turned to his old friend, with his eyes shining wet in the torchlight, and his voice, when it came, was thick and low and utterly without the bluster that had armored it his whole life long. He swore then, holding his true-born son, that he would not fail this boy as he had failed before, that he would not leave the raising of him to septas and to chance, that this child would be taught to be just and strong, and worthy of the seat he would one day hold. And Ned laid a hand upon his shoulder and said only that he believed him, and that was enough. The realm rejoiced as it had not rejoiced in a generation. Bells rang from the Sept of Baelor across the city, and were answered in every keep and village where the news could reach, and the great houses sent gifts and pledges and their fairest words, for a legitimate heir was a thing worth more than gold to lords weary of wondering what would come when the king was gone. The Tyrell alliance, already strong, was now bound to the throne by ties of blood that no scheming could easily undo, and whatever quiet hopes still lingered in the hearts of those who had once dreamed of a Lannister grandchild upon the Iron Throne guttered out like candles in a draught, unspoken and unmourned. Yet there was one man in whom the joy of the realm found no easy purchase, and that man was Stannis Baratheon. He had stood as heir presumptive since the day the false children were cast down, had ordered his mind and his duty around the grim expectation of a crown he had never sought but would have borne without complaint. And now, in the space of a single night, a squalling infant had displaced him from the succession entirely. He came to court to offer his congratulations, as duty demanded, and he offered them in a voice as cold and flat as the sea at Dragonstone, his jaw set hard beneath the black beard, and Robert saw the resentment beneath the courtesy as plainly as he had ever seen anything. But the king who held his son that morning was no longer the king who had let old wounds fester unattended, and rather than let his brother withdraw into bitterness, as he might once have done, Robert called Stannis aside into the small solar where the fire still burned, and there, with Ned as witness, he began to speak of something he had never before been willing to offer. What Robert offered his brother that morning was not a crown, for that was no longer his to give, but something Stannis had wanted far longer and had never once received, and that was gratitude, spoken aloud, and duty acknowledged before witnesses. He named Stannis Master of Ships in truth as well as in title, gave him leave to rule Dragonstone as more than a punishment posting, and swore before Ned that the loyalty his brother had shown him in the war and in the darker days after would not be forgotten while there was breath in his body. It was clumsy, as most things Robert did were clumsy, but it was honest, and Stannis, who had spent a lifetime measuring the distance between what he was owed and what he was given, heard in it something he had not expected to hear and did not quite know how to answer. He did not smile, for smiles came to him rarely, but the hard set of his jaw eased by some small degree, and when he left the solar he carried himself with a straightness that had less of a grievance in it than before. With the succession secured and the last of the old wounds tended, the great burden that had sat upon Eddard Stark's shoulders since the day he first rode south began at last to lift. He had come to King's Landing to serve a friend and to guard a throne, and he had done both through blood and betrayal and the near loss of his own head upon the steps of the Great Sept. And now, with the realm settling into a peace it had not known in years, there was nothing left to hold him in the south. Robert did not release him easily. The king had grown so accustomed to Ned's presence at his side, to the steady northern voice that told him hard truths when every other voice told him only what he wished to hear, that the thought of governing without it seemed to him a kind of loneliness he was not eager to embrace. But he was a better king now than he had been, and he understood that a man could not be kept forever from his home and his children merely because his presence was a comfort, and so he let his friend go. He did not let him go empty-handed. In gratitude for the counsel that had steadied his reign, and the loyalty that had, in the end, saved his very life, Robert opened the royal stores to the north with a generosity that astonished the court. Grain enough to see the northern small folk through 3 hard winters was set aside and sent north by ship and by cart. Gold flowed into the treasuries of Winterfell to mend what the long years of frugal rule had left wanting, and the king declared before the assembled lords that the friendship between Stark and Baratheon, forged in fostering and tempered in war, would be bound now in blood for the generations to come. A betrothal was struck, a Stark child promised to the crown, so that the 2 houses that had together pulled the realm back from ruin would be joined not merely by memory and affection, but by the lasting ties of marriage and lineage. And so it was that Eddard Stark rode home not as he had come. He had gone south to a warden, a lord of one region among many, honored but bound by the edges of his own domain, and he returned something more than that, whether he wished it or not. His hand had shaped the new order of the realm from its foundations. His judgment had steered the king through the treacheries that would have undone a lesser reign, and the marriage tie he carried north with him would outlast his own life, though the years in the south had taken from him too, in ways that no grain or gold could ever restore. He had not sought to change his house. He had sought only to do his duty and return to it unaltered. Yet duty, once taken up, has a way of remaking the man who bears it, and the Winterfell he rode toward would never again be quite the quiet northern fastness it had been before he left it, for the choices he had made in the south had reached their long fingers all the way home. The road north was long, and the air grew colder and cleaner with every league, until at last the gray walls of Winterfell rose out of the mist, as they had risen for 8,000 years, and the smoke of its hearths climbed into a pale northern sky. Within those walls, a boy who might in some other telling have fallen from a broken tower and never walked again, ran instead across the yard on strong young legs, his direwolf loping at his heels, and the sight of him whole and laughing was worth more to Eddard Stark than all the gold and grain in Robert's treasury. Bran had grown healthy in his father's absence, kept safe by the simple fact that Ned had returned to his duty rather than abandoning it, and the great tragedy that might have shattered the family had never come to pass. The direwolf pups had grown alongside the children, Summer at Bran's side, and Grey Wind and Nymeria and Lady and the rest each bound to their Stark. For in this telling, no queen's spite had demanded a wolf's life, though the peace the Starks now shared had been bought with distant griefs of its own, in the south and beyond the wall. Yet even here, in the warmth of the reunion and the safety of the ancient walls, something older than politics stirred. For Bran still dreamed, as he had always dreamed, of ravens with more eyes than any bird should have, of a cold that lay beyond the wall and waited patiently for the world to remember it. And when he woke in the gray light of morning, with summer's warm bulk pressed against him, he found he could not quite say whether the dreams were only dreams, or whether something far away was beginning, at last, to call his name. The ravens came south that autumn, in numbers that no maester at the wall could remember, and they carried words that would once have been dismissed as the fever dreams of frightened men huddled too long in the cold. Yet the reports did not scatter into disbelief, as they might have in another age, for the realm had been warned, and warning had made ready what fear alone could never have accomplished. The Lord Commander of the Night's Watch wrote of villages beyond the wall found emptied of the living, of wildlings pressing against Castle Black, not as raiders, but as refugees, fleeing something worse than any raid, and of shapes seen in the snow-thick dark that moved with the terrible patience of things that had never known hunger because they had never truly been alive. In another turning of the world, these letters might have gathered dust in the Red Keep, while lords quarreled over crowns. But this was not that world, and the words were read aloud in the small council chamber, with the seriousness they had always deserved. Robert Baratheon, gray now in his beard and heavier of step than the man who had once swung a warhammer through the ranks at the Trident, sat at the head of that council table and listened without laughter. The years had softened his body and slowed his blood, and there were mornings when his old wounds ached so fiercely that he could scarcely rise. Yet the fire that had made him a king had not gone out. It had only banked itself into something steadier. When the reading was done, he did not scoff. as another king might have, nor did he demand proof that no living man could bring him. He remembered the voice of his oldest friend speaking plainly across the miles of parchment over the years, warning of a cold that had never once relented, and he trusted that voice as he trusted little else in all the world. "Ned believes it," Robert said, and his hand closed slowly upon the arm of his chair. "And Ned has never in his life told me a comfortable lie. If he says the dead are walking, then by all the gods, old and new, we will meet them with the whole strength of the 7 kingdoms at our backs." That strength was no idle boast. The long peace that Robert's survival had purchased had made the realm rich in ways it had not known for generations, and the wealth of that peace now turned northward like a great tide, answering the pull of the moon. From the Reach came grain in wagons that stretched along the King's Road in lines no eye could count, sent by Mace Tyrell, who understood, as ambitious men always did, that loyalty shown in a moment of true need was worth more than 1,000 courtesies in easy times. From the west came steel, forged in part from the great indemnity that Tywin Lannister had paid to keep his family whole after the reckoning of years past, so that every blade drawn against the darkness carried within it the memory of a rebellion that had been swallowed by a stronger crown. And from every region men came, Greenlanders and mountain clansmen and knights of the Vale and stern lords of the north, marching to the wall not as one house serving one banner, but as a realm remembering, at last, why the wall had ever been raised. Ned Stark stood upon the icy battlements of Castle Black in a cloak grown stiff with frost, and he coordinated the gathering of the north with the quiet, unwavering diligence that had always been the truest measure of him. He was older now, his hair more silver than brown, but the cold suited him as it had always suited the men of his blood, and he moved among the assembling host with a calm that steadied everyone who looked upon him. It was here, in this place at the edge of the world, that he found his son again. Jon Snow had risen far in the years since he had first taken the Black, and he wore command now as naturally as he had once worn the awkwardness of a boy uncertain of his place. Men followed him without being ordered to, for there was in him a steadiness that spoke of something greater than the circumstances of his birth, and when he stood beside his father upon the wall, the two of them looked less like lord and bastard than like two branches of the same ancient tree. Ned watched him direct the placement of the men and the storing of the dragonglass that had come north in careful crates, and he knew that the time for silence had ended. They walked together to a chamber where a small fire struggled against the endless cold, and there, with the door closed and the wind moaning beyond the stone, Ned Stark spoke the words he had carried locked within his heart for the whole of his son's life. He told Jon of a promise made in a tower of red stone while a sister lay dying in a bed of blood and roses, of a marriage kept secret and a child born of it, and of the true name and the true blood that ran within the young man who had believed himself a bastard through all his years. He told him whose son he was, and whose sister had died to keep him from the world's cruelty, and he watched the knowledge settle upon Jon's face, like the first snow settling upon frozen ground. "I should have told you long ago," Ned said quietly, his voice rough with the weight of years. "But the realm has need of every leader it can find now, and you must know who you are before the long night comes for us all." Jon said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire as the wind rose higher outside the walls. Word of the assault came south on the wings of ravens, black birds flying through a sky already darkening with something that was not merely night. The dead had come at last to the wall, and no longer as scattered wights or wandering horrors glimpsed at the edge of the world, but as an army beyond counting, a tide of frozen faces stretching from the frost fangs to the shivering sea. The message that reached King's Landing was brief and terrible, and when it was read aloud in the great hall, a silence fell that no one dared to break, for every man and woman present understood that the moment they had spent years preparing for had finally arrived, and that all their labor would now be tested against the only enemy that had ever truly mattered. Robert Baratheon heard the tidings from the same chair he had sat in for a decade of ruling, his beard gone gray and his great frame diminished by the passing years, though never so diminished as it might have been. The wound the boar had given him had healed long ago into a pale seam across his ribs, a reminder each morning when he rose of how close he had come to leaving the world without ever seeing it made right. He had grown old in a way he had never expected to, not the slow rot of wine and idleness that Ned had once feared for him, but the weathered aging of a man who had found purpose again and clung to it through the long work of holding a kingdom together. Now, hearing that the enemy had come, he set down the cup in his hand and rose to his feet with a slowness that spoke of aching joints and a heart grown tired, and he called for his warhammer to be brought. Those around him protested, as he had known they would. His maesters spoke of his age and the cold that would settle into his bones. His knights spoke of the danger and the folly of a king riding to the deadliest battle the realm had ever faced, and even his son, grown now into a young man of steady temper, begged him to remain in the capital and let others carry the fight. But Robert only shook his great head and looked toward the north as though he could already see the storm gathering there. "I nearly let this realm fall once," he said, his voice roughened by years, but still carrying the old thunder. "I sat drunk upon a throne I never wanted while the world went to ruin around me, and it was the Boar and the Stark both that woke me from it. I'll not die in a bed with wine on my breath, while the men of this kingdom bleed to keep the dead from swallowing us all. If I am to go, let me go with my hammer in my hands and my friend at my side." So the king rode north one last time, and the sight of him upon the King's Road drew men from every holdfast and village he passed, until what had begun as a royal escort became an army swelling with each mile. At the wall he found the realm already gathered, as it had never been gathered in living memory, Northmen standing shoulder to shoulder with Reachmen, who had marched the whole length of the continent, Westermen and Stormlords, and the Black Brothers of the Night's Watch, all arrayed beneath the command of Jon, who bore now the quiet weight of the truth his father had given him, and led as one born to it. The unity that had brought them there was no accident of fortune, but the fruit of a decade of Robert's survival and Ned's patient counsel, the slow knitting together of a kingdom that in another telling would have torn itself to pieces before the true war ever began. The battle that followed was the longest and most terrible the realm had ever known, waged beneath a sky where the sun seemed to have forgotten how to rise, upon fields of snow that turned black with the ruin of the fallen. The dead came in waves without end, and again it seemed the line must break. Yet each time it held because the men who stood upon it had learned to trust one another, to fight not as rivals or as the levies of quarreling lords, but as one people bound by a common survival. Fire took what steel could not, and the coordination of the defenders, the passing of dragonglass from hand to hand, the sacrifice of those who stood in the breaches so that others might close them. And it was Jon, driving dragonglass into the heart of the thing that commanded them, who broke the dead in a single instant, every wight and walker crumbling to the snow as their maker fell. And in the final press of that battle, as the enemy's power faltered, and the living began to feel the first fragile hope of victory, Robert Baratheon fell. He had fought as he had in his youth, his hammer rising and falling with a strength that seemed to have returned to him from some deeper well. And he had held his ground until the last of the great cold things went down before him, and only then did he stagger. Only then did the wounds he had taken finally claim their due. Ned reached him where he lay in the trampled snow, and knelt beside him as the din of battle faded into the quiet of an ending, and took the hand of the friend he had saved twice over, once from the boar and once from himself. Robert looked up at him with eyes still bright, and something like peace moved across his weathered face, and he tried to speak, his lips forming the beginning of words that Ned leaned close to hear. "You saved them," Robert breathed, his voice no more than a whisper against the cold, and his gaze drifted past Ned to the fires still burning where the living had gathered, to the banners that yet stood against the gray dawn. "You saved us all." His grip tightened once, briefly, with the last of a strength that had once toppled dragons, and then it eased, and the great heart that had beaten so wildly through so many years of feasting and fighting and sorrow grew still. Ned knelt beside him a long while in the trampled snow, holding the hand of the friend he had followed into war and out of it again, and he did not weep. Not then, for grief that deep has no water in it, only silence. Around them, the dead lay motionless at last, and the wind that had howled with unnatural malice for so long softened into an ordinary cold, and somewhere far above the clouds began to break. They carried Robert south with all the honor a king could be given, and they laid him to rest, not in the black vaults beneath King's Landing, but in a place of open sky where the wind could reach him, for he had never been a man for stone rooms and shadowed halls. The songs that were sung of him afterward did not dwell on his failures, on the debts or the drink or the years he had let the realm drift, but on the day he had risen from a boar's tusks, refusing to die, and the day he had ridden north to spend his life buying the dawn for those who would never know his face. He had become, in death, the thing he had always half wished to be in life, a man remembered for the best that was in him. The boy who inherited the throne was young and true-born, black of hair and steady of eye, and he was crowned in a city that had not seen a true and undisputed succession in living memory. A regency council took the weight of governance upon its shoulders until he should come of age, and at its head stood Eddard Stark, named Lord Protector of the realm, a man who had never wanted power and who wielded it, therefore, more justly than any who craved it. Beside him sat Marjorie Tyrell as Queen Mother, gentle in her manner and shrewd beneath it, tending to the young king's education with a care that shaped him toward mercy rather than fear. Stannis served as hand, stern and unbending and utterly reliable, the kind of man who would never be loved and never be doubted. And under his cold and tireless stewardship, the accounts were balanced, and the laws were kept, and the granaries were filled against the memory of winters still fresh in every mind. The great houses settled into their places in the new order, like stones finding their seats in a wall. Tywin Lannister, who had spent his life reaching for a permanence that would outlast him, found his ambitions quietly and firmly curbed. His gold still counted, but his reach at last confined, and he lived out his remaining years as a lord, and no more than a lord. Cersei, whose schemes had once nearly torn the realm to pieces, ended her days in a quiet holdfast, far from any throne, her fire banked and her plots exhausted, watching the sea and thinking whatever thoughts such a woman thinks when there is nothing left to grasp. But Jaime, who had chosen truce over slaughter in the war for the dawn, who had ridden north when he might have stayed safe and warm, was redeemed by that choosing, and in time, The white cloak he had worn in shame was worn again in honor, and men who had once spat the name Kingslayer learned to speak it differently. And Jon Snow, who had held the wall and led the free folk and spent himself against the endless dark, was honored at last as the hero of the long night, and the truth of his blood was spoken plainly and without fear, for there was no throne left to threaten, and no dragon queen to war against, only a realm grateful to be alive. He was reconciled to the crown, given lands and a name and a place, and though he chose the north for his home, as all his father's people did, he was welcome now in any hall in Westeros, a living reminder that the accident of one's birth need never be the whole measure of one's worth. When the young king came of age and took the full weight of his crown upon himself, Ned Stark was at last free to go home for good, and he rode north through a country that had known peace for the whole of that boy's growing, a country spared the war of 5 kings that might have shattered it, spared the divided and desperate defense that might have doomed it. He came to Winterfell in the gray hour before dawn and climbed to the old battlements where he had stood as a young man, and he watched the sun come up over the Wolfswood and the snow-covered hills, and below him in the warming halls his children slept, all of them living, all of them home. He thought then of the Kingswood, of a boar and a moment's mercy, of the choice to warn a friend rather than let him ride blind to his death, and he understood that everything good in the world he now looked upon had flowed from that single quiet act of loyalty. Honor had not cost him his head after all. Patience had outlasted cunning, and friendship had outlasted ambition, and against every rule of the terrible game that men played for the Iron Chair, the gentler things had won. And Eddard Stark, watching the light spread golden across his lands, was at peace. And this brings us to the end of this alternate history. If you enjoyed exploring how events might have unfolded differently, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. We dive into new stories from the world of Westeros every single day, imagining the choices, battles, alliances, and destinies that could have completely changed the fate of the 7 kingdoms. And if you'd like to explore even more stories, our Lorekeeper members unlock a brand new exclusive alternate history every single week. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think would have happened next? Did this version of history end better than the original, or would you have taken the story in a completely different direction? Leave your ideas in the comments, because many of the best future stories come directly from your suggestions. Thank you so much for watching and for spending your time with me. I'll see you tomorrow with another alternate history from Westeros. Until then, peace out.